So as we saw in the circular flow, the government's actions in budgets can have an impact at two major places in the flow. In terms of the budgetary decisions. And because this makes a difference to how we think of what's happening, it's worth actually looking at a government's budget. In the exercise that you will be doing for this class, you will be getting data on the US government budget, and you will be actually asked to take a look at the economy and make a case for different kinds of economic policy based on those numbers. So here we go. If you think of a government's budget, it's like any other budget. It has various categories of what it's getting its money from. It's going to have revenue sources. And the most important and normal category of revenue for most governments is taxes. It depends on the country you're in. There are some countries, for example, where governments actually own resources. So think of Saudi Arabia. One of the major sources of revenue for the Saudi Arabian government is oil. They actually own the oil, and they actually get revenue by the exports of oil. So there are countries in which public enterprises, publicly owned enterprises owned by the government, generate revenue. In most countries, except for countries which have that kind of situation, taxes turn out to be the major way in which you actually get revenues, which is that the government takes a cut of your income. And it does it in various ways. You can have sales taxes, you can have income taxes, you can have debates about whether you should have wealth and estate taxes, questions about whether you should have capital gains taxes, corporate taxes, and things like that. Those are questions about the tax burden. Who will pay the taxes? And there are some really serious public policy concerns having to do with equity or growth that are embedded in that. In macro, we're going to just focus on overall taxation burdens for now, total, wherever it's coming from. And we're going to have debates about what the volume of taxes should be. If you're interested in more details about the distribution of the tax burden, who should pay it, how and in what way, then you have to add additional concerns beyond stability to include questions of equity and growth. So for now, let's just focus on total taxation. And remember that there is still a whole bunch of work you can do on who should pay the taxes. There's an entire field of public finance devoted to these questions. And as I said, in addition to taxes, in some governments, you're going to see budgets that include other areas such as public sector enterprises, which earn substantial revenues because they sell stuff, oil exports being the most famous, mineral cessions, that the government earns money from. And then what does it do is it spends. And I'm going to just put a little question mark around this, less because I have doubts about the spending, but because we are going to now have to think through the spending in multiple ways. The government takes this revenue and it spends it on many things. First and foremost, the government actually spends it on acquiring new final goods and services. It pays for airplanes. It pays for military personnel. It pays for judges. Right? It pays for maintaining courthouses. Right? Just like any household, any firm, when the government acquires a new final good or service, it has to spend, it has to have an expenditure on that new final good or service. This is what I'm going to call G, or government expenditures. Now, many people are very tempted to include all types of spending by the government under G for government expenditure. But remember that the government spends money in multiple ways. One way is it actually acquires new final goods and services, which is what becomes part of your aggregate expenditure. The other way government often spends money is that it doesn't go out and buy new final goods and services. It actually transfers that into people's pockets And it's those people who do the spending on new final goods and services. So think of lots of the things that are debates about. Social Security. It's useful, it's easy to think, oh, the government's spending so much money on Social Security. What's happening is the government is transferring. It's taken a tax and it's using that tax to transfer to others. So when we look at the budget, we're actually going to look at categories of transfer payments in the US budget because they are large. And you're going to find, for example, that out of transfers, there's things like retirement accounts, payment for veterans, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and a category called temporary assistance for needy families, which are all part of the transfers. And you're going to have to spend some time looking at the budget, and you're going to have to let me know exactly how much money is going into all of these things, because you've heard of them politically. Oh my God, this is huge. Well, take a look. How huge is it? Relative to the overall budget, is it 10%, 3%, 2%, 30%, 0.2%? What's going on? And then, essentially, if your expenditures and your transfers exceed your taxes, you're spending more than you're getting. That's a deficit. It's not the debt, it's the deficit. So the deficit is the amount by which your spending exceeds your earning in a given year. The debt is how much you owe totally. So think of it this way. The deficit may be how much extra did my spending this year exceed my income. That's not same as your debt, which is what is the total amount I owe, putting everything together, right? If, for example, my intake, my taxes exceed my expenditures and transfers, right, then I've got a budget surplus. And if they are exactly the same, then I've got a balanced budget. How does the government manage to handle deficits and surpluses? It figures out ways to borrow. It issues treasury bills, bonds, right? It goes to, in some cases, it actually prints money. There's ways it can do this. Overall, this is the basic structure of a government budget. Right? Just as there are questions about who should bear the tax burden, there are very interesting questions about the expenditures. What are you spending it on anyway? No. Are you spending it on the military? Well, that's interesting. That might have certain kinds of payoffs in some situations for political reasons. In other situations, it may not be the best growth strategy. It might be that you're better off putting this expenditure into, say, education, right? So, for example, we know that in the East Asian Miracle, human capital investment, severe and strong government investment into basic health, education, infrastructure made a huge difference for their growth. So there are questions about what is the government spending it on anyway. Transfers, there are similar questions. How much of this transfers are because you are providing support for people in the middle of COVID? That's one thing. That might actually be useful. How much of this is something that's going to help address income inequality? Well, that's interesting, but maybe there are other strategies having to do, for example, with changes in wages or things like that, that might address it better. And then there are different societies with different understandings of how you handle questions of public goods, public infrastructure, and so on. So lots of debates about transfers, who's getting them. Lots of debates about whether or not the underlying problem is that the transfers are too high, or whether or not the underlying problem is that there are too many tax loopholes, which is why we're in this situation. Lots of debates about where's the money going, right? But overall, our focus right now is that I'm less focused on who's getting it, but I'm looking at it put together, right? So we're going to look then at the impact of this government budget, which has three categories I'm interested: taxes, transfers, government expenditures. And we're going to look at the impact of that on my circular flow by focusing on whether or how, by adjusting any of these three items, I can change my equilibrium level of income. And if so, how can I do that in a way to intervene in recessions? Thank you.